Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to City Futures Research Centre seminar series. I'm Dr. Richard Billingsley. Today's seminar is being held on the traditional land of Aboriginal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present, and especially to any First Nations people who are joining us today. In a moment, I will ask Professor Fatemeh to introduce our speaker for today. First, some quick housekeeping. If you're joining online, please mute your microphone and turn off the camera during the presentation. Then when we get to the Q&A, if you'd like to turn these back on, then you're very welcome to do so. You can also put a question into the chat. My associate Ali will be monitoring the chat for questions. Today we've got a very interesting talk about design and neurodiversity. So I'd like to introduce Professor Fatemeh, that he's the Director of City Futures, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Richard. So welcome to our fourth seminar, I believe, for the year 2024. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. So Dr. Fatemeh Aminpour. Fatemeh is currently a lecturer in the School of Built Environment and research fellow in City Futures Research Centre. She's educational focused, but even being educationally focused, she has a rich research program that she's leading. And today she's going to be talking about her work on designing for neurodiversity, inclusive design principles in early years learning spaces. So Fatemeh has a lot of work working with schools, young people, and dealing with those challenges facing our youth in designing better cities. So it's a multidisciplinary team that Fatemeh is leading, and I'll hand over to Fatemeh to give her presentation.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody, for joining me today. I'm going to talk about design for neurodiversity with a focus on inclusive design principles in early years learning spaces. And this is a project that was funded by ADA Faculty Research Office. And I actually did this research along with Associate Professor Jennifer Scatterbull, who is now a Deputy Director at Teacher Research Centre at Western Sydney University, and Professor Elon Katz, who is the Professor of Social Policy at in SPRC UNSW. So why are we focusing on this topic? Because we know that 1 in 7 children in Australia are neurodivergent, and the rate of diagnosis is actually rapidly rising. And we know that disability standards for education wanted to make sure that accessibility is there for all students with disability. But on the other hand, we have Building Code of Australia that fails to acknowledge the needs of neurodivergent people. We, in this project, build on the environmental model of disability, not the medical model of disability. It means that we shift the onus of responsibility from the individual to be cued to the environment that actually facilitate their participation in the society. And this topic is important because New South Wales Department of Education is going to build about 100 new universally designed preschools by 2027. And they want this to be designed universally, means that it should be inclusive. And it also important because it addresses the shortage of staff that we are now facing in the education department. So if we build inclusive spaces, it will narrow the individual's adjustment that is required from teachers. So they will have more capacity for content delivery instead. And we believe that physical environment really matters. And it's a quote from one of our participant who is not an architect. My background is in architecture, so I'm advocating in this space, but this is from somebody who is an educator. So they believe that really physical environment matters. There is nothing about the actual physical facilities that help the educators and the children. The new buildings should be up to the fire risk rating, and we've got to manage climate change. But actually, if we're cutting costs in acoustics or some of these simple things in transit space or staff, that should be essential, should be required to be inclusive. So there is more money going into trying to train up staff, and that's important, but nothing mentioned about how the physical environment contributes. So it actually addresses this, what I brought up about the lack of attention to the inclusive design requirements. And the other educator, as they believe, policymakers don't believe in that. They don't believe that the physical environment really matters in this space. So she said, the thing I try to do is first broaden their knowledge and their deep understanding, because I have noticed that if I don't work in that edge, they will not understand how much the physical environment actually affects the students. They don't believe in that. Okay, so what do we mean by neurodiversity? It's a broad range. So some people are hypersensitive. It means that sensory stimulation is magnified in these people. They're really sensitive to bright light, to loud sound, sensitive to touch, texture and temperature. And there is the other, end of this extreme, which is hypersensitive. It means that sensory stimuli is subdued. They underreact to sound and lighting, and so it's a range actually, or a spectrum as we call it. So the methods that we used to reach this data, we did literature review. Still we're doing this, not complete. We also conducted a focus group with a broad range of people from different backgrounds, from education, from architects, early educators, and also we did 4 expert in-depth interviews with early childhood intervention, somebody who is in early childhood intervention services, 2 architects who are academics as well, and also an academic who is in special education. So I'm going to talk about all of these things in 1 hour, and we're going to talk about our next steps. What do we need to do next? So from our stakeholder consultations and from our literature review, we know that acoustics is very important. There is a correlation between noise levels and the frequency of target behaviors in children with autism, for example. It means that when there are louder noise exposed to these people, they show more repetitive movement. They complain a lot. They blink their eyes. They cover their ears. We can see repetitive speech, etc., etc. So one of the main important things that was brought up in our stakeholder consultation was how we need to prevent, design buildings that prevent echoing. So one of the things is just that we need to prevent from, we don't need high ceilings or those materials that bounce sound. So we need to soundproof. It's really critical, as I mentioned. But is that something that is usually done in this space? It's that when we talk about acoustics, it's not about silencing of the space. As one of the experts said, it's a curation of acoustic environment. It's not about dampening all the sound. We still need intelligible speech to come through. So for students, it also means that they need to get feedback, sound feedback that they need. Sometimes they actually create sound and noise because they want to get feedback. So it's not about silencing the space. but making sure that it, we prevent from echo and just very high pitch and low pitch noise. Lighting is important. We need to make sure that we prevent from glare and those artificial lighting that flickers. And we need to manage shadows as well. And literature suggests high-level windows to the exterior to access to natural lighting. So it means that we are less dependent on artificial lighting that can cause problems. Also, visual clutter is very annoying to this population, and it's really interesting because we're talking about early childhood education centers, and it's usually visual clutter is kind of part of this everyday life. So one of these experts says, I still struggle with the fact that there was so much stuff in the room because it actually, with visual clutter, students can struggle regulating their own behavior. And they redesigned one of the rooms for this population, and they said that it's really blank looking to adults' eyes, but it limits the clutter for the students. About the color, there is not much in the literature actually, and when we asked from the experts, they gave us anecdotal kind of references, and they don't really look like those colors that are on the screen. So it's a blue to green spectrum of color. It's I think only blue on the screen right now, and airstone colors, neutral colors. And those colors that we need to prevent, it's just yellow and red, and those warm colors. Cooler colors are mostly preferred. Material, natural material preferred, wood, stone, cotton-based fabric, and it's not just because of its visual that the natural material visually doesn't create that visual clutter. But it's also about tactility. It should be as neutral as possible, especially for those surfaces that people are in direct contact with. Sensory smell and the environments that actually engages this sense, very important. And there is not much reference in the literature. I couldn't find any, but kitchens and dining areas are very problematic spaces in early childhood education centers. They are really important spaces, and families want their children to get used to food and eating, but actually eating is a multi-sensory experience for these children, and they already struggle with that because you touch the food, you taste the food, you smell the food, and integration of this sensory information is something that they struggle with, this population. And it actually comes with dining areas that are really noisy, very busy, very rushed, with large group of students, and they are already struggling with those, and just more sensory information are exposed to that. So it's one of the problematic areas. So one of the solutions is to make sure that the kitchen and dining areas are quite isolated, and sensory compartmentalization or zoning is one of the inclusive design principles in this space. It can also be used for teaching zones. So each zone has a kind of identifiable character that activities can be associated with. The child can associate those activities and functions with that zone. And the other thing is that we need different zones, multiple zones, because this population is very diverse. Their needs are really diverse. And the other thing is that we need to connect these zones together. So if it's a high stimulating environment and low stimulating environment that we design, we need to make sure that they are really connected. So it provides choice for the different individuals to choose their own environment, and also for skill development. So we don't want to style this child. It's just we want them to push their boundaries a little bit so they can actually transition to those mainstream schools or to those mainstream classrooms. So we need a range of different environments and a spectrum of places, as they said. And how many zones do we need in this case? We need adequate separation. So it really depends on the size of the cohort, the extent of their needs, and the extremes of their abilities, as one of the architects in our study said. Okay, so we talked about different zones and the connection between these zones, but we need to make sure that this connection doesn't happen abruptly. So we need a kind of transition between these zones. So transitional spaces or thresholds are, the points of exchange. They are places that the user can recalibrate their senses when they come, when they're moving from a low stimulating environment, with a lot of noise and smell and sound, to a low stimulating environment, quiet and calm. They need to recalibrate their senses. They need that space. They need to pause. So one of the spaces that that we need to consider is the transitional space between outside and inside, because outside spaces, so we have one of these here, like foyer and the veranda are those transitional spaces that usually happens, not always, but it usually happens. And then they help with a change of light or change of temperature that when somebody moves from outside to inside. Just think about that these can be really dramatic. These changes can be really dramatic for neurodivergent individuals. So it's not for it's really comfortable when it happens to neurotypical people, but it's essential for this population. Okay, and the other thing that our architects said in the study was that we need to design spaces that this population doesn't need to go outside again and inside again. So if they change, or if they come from outside to inside, they don't really need to go outside. So we limit this kind of like transitional spaces in this case. The need for having this transitional space. Within internal spaces, we also need transitional spaces that have sight lines, and this actually gives the user kind of preview in advance, so they actually can see what they're expecting. They're entering the place. It reduces their anxiety around entering an unfamiliar space. So one of the principles that can be used, organic and flowing forms with curved walls or corners that help the person see what's really happening next. They want to know what's expected. And also transitional space within outdoor play spaces. I'm going to read this aloud because it's a very interesting quote. So if you've got a playground, there will be those children who want to play in the playground and at the center of it. And there will be others who want to be more peripheral. And it's important to give them the opportunity who might just want to watch or just be on the edge and realize that there is learning on that. And that might help be a transitional space that over time, they might go from being on the edge to dipping their toe in the water and wanting to get involved. Or there is that thing about if you're there, that people might come and talk to you, which is really, really important. It's realizing that different people at different times will want a different level of interaction. We don't really usually consider these edges in the school of, in the design of school environments or outdoor school environments. Also, we need to consider crowding in circulation areas and corridors, or having these transitional spaces in these areas as well, so they can pause, reflect, and converse, and observe others, what's really happening next. But but it's not usually what it happens, you know, they're just keeping on the toes. It's just a very rushed line of students going through the corridors, and they have too much contact with other students, and it can be really fearful. The other thing is that adults crowd the space too. And it really happens in this space because of the child-adult ratio. So we have usually for this population additional educators, and then, for example, in speech pathologies, and so we have more adults in this space for this population, and they crowd the space because just to consider the size of adults. And under current regulations, we can have more adults in this space without considering that they actually crowd the space. So this is something that should be considered in the requirements if they are going to set some. And then the layout is important to help, you know, create a routine and predictability, as I mentioned before, they need a kind of sense of a structure, and the layout, this spatial sequencing helps them to, you know, expect, as I said earlier, expect what's really going to happen next. And they can prevent the crowd if they can see that, or they can, you know, prepare themselves to deal with that. Otherwise, it's very anxiety-inducing. And these open plan environments don't help at all. They don't offer that kind of a structure or special sequencing, or that they don't create that routine that they need to have in the environment. So they found it too overwhelming because it's not really organized. They also need those visual cues in the environment to see what's going to happen where. Color and texture can give them these visual cues. And one of these people in early childhood intervention services said that when we have these visual cues in the environment, it means that educators need less to organize children, or they need less institutionalizing. So also we need to make sure that these visual cues happen at a young child's perspective. It's not at an adult eye kind of point of view. So we need to consider scale of the users as well. Yeah, one of the examples said see-through doors. So those doors that they don't have a window, they are not transparent, they are not really happen because without opening the door, they can't really see what's they are expecting behind that door. So it's a big problem. And in terms of wayfinding, technology can help a lot because we know that every building that we build, it's already in the it's already designed and built in the virtual space. So we can use those virtual models of the buildings as a kind of media maps for this population. Also, we can use virtual reality to get their feedback on the space. You know, they can just walk through the space virtually and just give us what's really working, tell us what's really working or what's not really working. But you know, before they come to for example, an early childhood education center, they can have these virtual tours around the space. So they adjust themselves in the space, just see what's really they can expect next in their walking tours around the center. And they can keep revisiting the school or the center and reorient themselves. Also, it's important that you know, the educators said architects design these spaces, but we need to teach students and educators how they can use different spaces. So they also need to be equipped with this knowledge, how these different spaces are helpful. So I move on to the natural spaces and natural environments and how they can be helpful. They are really calming and should be part of the design of you know, every inclusive environment. In terms of you know, children's spaces, we know from the literature that nature can help children with autism tolerate and process information. And it's really interesting because natural environments can expose a lot of sensory information at the same time, like sound, smell, noise. But the research shows that despite all of these sensory information, children can regulate better in these environments. And adaptive functioning of children with autism increases in the presence of animals. When they were compared to the children who were playing with toys, animals were really more helpful. And by adaptive functioning, I mean, these people have a difficult time facing the demand of everyday life. So they can be more functioning in this environment. And natural patterns can minimize visual discomfort for people who are hypersensitive, because they are kind of in contrast with man-made environments, with those tessellated or bars or those types of forms that we usually find discomforting. They usually create this visual clutter, but natural environments, they don't. So this piece actually was published in the Conversation like a week ago. So you probably would like to have a look at that. Retreat spaces. They are spaces that give the user or the child space to recharge their batteries. If they find the main area, the main room, the main classroom, for example, very overwhelming before they have a tantrum or before they get really anxious, when they want some time on their own, they can withdraw from these spaces and just go to this retreat space. And these retreat spaces could be something, could have some natural elements, natural environments, could be outdoors or indoors. And I'm going to go through the some of the characteristics of these spaces. But before that, we had a conversation with these educators and architects about breakout rooms, if it's possible to have them in early childhood education centers, or if they are going to work. So breakout rooms are those rooms that are attached to the main room, but they are common. Usually they have good acoustics, and lighting is dim, and they provide a calm environment for these people. But there are some concerns about the safety of, or security of children around this, in these rooms, because they are not necessarily attached directly to the main room, so probably it needs another additional staff to be there. But they introduced these home rooms or satellite classes, that it means that the center is inclusive, the center is mainstream, and then they have this additional homeroom that caters for this specific population. So, for example, only neurodivergent students can use this homeroom or satellite classes. So it's not age dependent, and it's not a retreat room. It's actually their own room. And we already have them as part of our education system. It's as of July of 2021, there are 113 satellite classes operating within New South Wales Department of Education and Catholic primary and secondary schools. And they can help schools manage this child educator ratios, because they demand higher ratios, more number of educators in these homerooms to handle students, and they can actually manage staff shortages and the fees parents are usually charged with, because they need more staff in these rooms. But there is a problem with that, because it creates almost a bubble of these micro classes. Children become really reliant on their aid, on these spaces, and they don't want to go back to the mainstream classrooms. Because, for example, it's loud and it's really crowded, and they don't really get that much support that they get in those satellite classes. And one of the educators said that, my experience is that all these small groups arrangements very sudden become permanent. And also the students that need this arrangement, they rise. So if they are 5 from the beginning, after 6 months, they are 8. And in 2 years time, there are 19 students going to this, small groups. So they don't really provide this transitioning experience from these specific rooms or special education to mainstream classrooms. So they were talking about these embedded retreat spaces. They are not necessarily used by neurodivergent people. It can be used by everybody. Everybody loves those retreat spaces, but they are part of those mainstream classrooms, and they can be easily supervised. So, they can be part of the furniture, because these children are really small and they can feel, snuggled in those like bean type chairs, or they can have a window seat, with cushions on, or nooks and crannies that are not necessarily very enclosed, so they can be still supervised. So these can happen naturally in the design of a center and could be a part of the mainstream classroom. The layout of the classroom can better help to create these embedded retreat spaces. So, for example, on the here on the right-hand side, there is a playroom that doesn't have those nooks and crannies. It's just one square, and they tried to create those subspaces with bookshelves, but from the from the experience of one of our CIs, it wasn't really helpful. It was part of another project, not this one. And then these 2 playrooms that are kind of like having that L shape, they created those nooks and crannies. They could be still supervised, but they could be tending to those retreat spaces. So people can actually withdraw from the main playroom to this next one. And the other thing is that educators need space too. And because we have more educators in these centers and we need more collaboration between them, we need space so they can actually talk to each other and collaborate and just come up with some solutions to deal with situations. One of our participants said that these spaces doesn't generate revenue, but still help retain staff. So it's important consideration. Yeah. And one of the main points coming from this study is to co-design with neurodivergent users. I'm going to read aloud this quote because it's very interesting. Experts are those with the disability or with the impairment, or the families or the practitioners. It's not the architectural profession. I think that's still a bit of a barrier to much of the profession. I think architects were egotistical a lot, and we work and it takes like 8, 9, 10 years to graduate, and there is the idea that we know it all and we don't at all, and that's really important. Also, educators brought this up that we design for organizations. We don't design for the end users. We talk to clients that are organizations and they want to, increase their revenue, and, their priorities are different. And it's co-design is not easy. It's really challenging, as she said, and it's quite challenging to do this well, but it's really critical. And the other person in intervention services said that it's really important to co-design and bring somebody on the table, somebody who is the end user and have a voice, to have a voice, and especially when it comes to those compromises they need. So, for example, if they want to cut the cost at some points and they want to make really those hard decisions, they want to know what's the priority. Retrofitting. it's important because not every center is designed to fit purpose from the beginning, and we have lots of centers, that's or other buildings that they are being repurposed to be a early childhood education center or a school. But it's a barrier actually to those who don't really know how to do that. And the clients, for example, this is special education person in special education says that they believe that they can't really do anything. They found it really impossible. Because they said, we have all these large groups and many different needs in one classroom, but still there are a lot that can be done. So it was the question of the other educator, what are the most important things to do within our little capital expenditure budget? So we asked this from an architect, and she said acoustical modification that could be, inexpensively done to add, strategic materials in the strategic locations, or you can introduce retreat spaces using furniture. And those pop-up play tents, small changes, or it can be you can actually introduce a special sequencing that works for this population by changing the operation of the building. So you can reschedule some activities or reallocate spaces to activities, so you can actually separate those high stimulating activities from low stimulating activities, so they don't really clash. And the final remark is that neurodiversity is really an advantage, not a deficit, and it can help inform better environments for everyone. So when we talk about inclusive design, one of our experts said that actually inclusive is not a good term, because we're already thinking about excluding a population. So it's about making the space available for everybody. And in my consultations with the students before, when they talk about spaces that they like, a lot of these things resonated with me, because we did results of my previous studies, and even neurotypical students that I talked to. So everybody actually benefits from all these design principles, not just neurodivergent people. Thank you.
Right, I'd like to thank you very much, Fatemeh. That's a very informative talk, a very important topic. And any help for special needs environments is very valuable for participants, educators, and parents. Now, we do have about 15 minutes or so for questions. So if anyone has a question or a comment, please do go ahead.
Bruce, what are the priorities for the BCA?
Building Code of Australia. Yeah. Okay. First is to set some requirements actually for this public, because there is no accessibility requirements for this population. We have accessibility requirements for people with physical disabilities, but not for neurodivergent.
Suitable housing standards.
Yeah. Yes.
Something like that be developed?
Not in Australia. We don't have in Australia, and there is one in the UK. I'm not really sure. I don't think that it's mandated, but there is some sets of requirements. But when I reviewed those, it's not like it's not all based on research, because we don't really know much about all of these things very strongly. So yeah, it's but still good to have a set of requirements already in place.
Would you advocate something like the livable housing standards?
Yes, sure. It's not about just housing. The one in the UK, it's not about just housing. It's more about public spaces. So those individuals that don't really have a voice in the design of those spaces. So yes, that could be. Yeah. Yes.
No, that was such a great presentation. Thank you. It's such important research to do into non-neurotypical person. So thank you. I was wondering, so first, I don't know if I missed it because I was matching the chat, but what is the age group when you're saying like early education? Are you referring to like up to like kindergarten? Up to 5. Okay, so preschool kind of age.
Yes.
Okay, so then my question is this research I'm assuming was focusing on like the actual like centres, education centres. Is there any scope for maybe research in the future that looks at like home daycare and how that factors in the how neurodiversity like architecture or like how they can be made more neuro friendly?
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
One is that actually diagnosis, I think Jennifer probably can answer this question better, but diagnosis happens I don't really think that it happens very early. So many children are not still diagnosed when they are very young, infants, for example. And the research that we have are mostly done in high school space because they can better communicate with the researchers. And we don't know much in primary school space or preschool spaces. We don't really know much. But yeah, that's a good question.
We do have a question online from Jeanette Finch Jesperson saying, this was really interesting and important. Thank you so much for sharing all your research here. A question on the colours. The cooler versus warm colours. What was was that an indoor feature primarily, and a research finding by Mustafa?
Yes, that was mostly interior for interior spaces. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Just on the colour thing, UNSW would be a disaster. It's yellow all over the place. So maybe you should have a word with the facilities managers to try and get that changed. Just one question about the facilities that you've put up. Am I right in understanding, well, the 2 examples you had, those sort of plans were separate sort of specialist facilities? Or, but a lot of the shots, the photographs you took were of mainstream, or interpreted as mainstream school locations. So the question, I suppose, is the principles that you've come up with, are they applicable or applicable to mainstream primary and infant school situations, as well as specialist facilities? Because I think it's easier to do it in a specialist facility because obviously you can design it especially for that group of people. And I've got a nephew who's neurodivergent. He's older now, but his parents decided to send him to a normal school in the north of England. I don't think it did him any favours personally, because there was nowhere special for him to be when he was overwrought and couldn't cope. So I mean, kind of interesting how far principles can be embedded in mainstream school facilities as well as the specialist stuff.
Yes, some of those, I think many of those images that were taken were from specialist education facilities, and it's a really challenge because mainstream schools, public schools, it's not easy and it's really costly to retrofit. So they usually come up with this idea of having a separate room for that's designed to fit that purpose. So to cater this population separately, but our research shows that it's. Yep. When I asked about how these rooms are being operated, they said that because of the ratio adult and children, it's easier to manage, and we can design this from scratch. And also, children are free to use the mainstream rooms and just go there, explore a little bit, and they want to more comfort. They can go back to their homeroom. But the other educators, they said that. They don't really go there. They don't really venture out. Right. And they just stay there, and they don't really push their boundaries. Right. So it makes this transition to mainstream really difficult. So we actually introduced this topic because Department of Education are now designing this inclusive preschools, so it can be something done from scratch, and it's not really costly if you consider it when you design, when the layout and wayfinding, all these principles, when you think about all these principles from the beginning.
Can I speak from online?
Yes, you absolutely can.
Hi, I'm Jen. I'm working on the project with Fatemeh. I think that there's a couple of issues there. Is that this work that we're doing is primarily focused on mainstream settings, both early childhood and or school. So we are thinking it's important to look at that transition that children can make from an environment where the sensory input is managed to one where they slowly learn to manage it more for themselves. So that story about your nephew in some ways shows that it can be really overwhelming if you don't have an escape or a retreat space. But that those spaces are quite important for recalibrating and then being able to kind of work out what levels of engagement with more sensory input is comfortable and how you can function well. But one of the things that I think has come up really strongly in the research is that teachers don't know how to do that. So you can have the spaces, but if the teachers themselves aren't setting up the spaces or grouping children in the way that maximises the benefits of the spaces, then you lose them. And if children don't learn how to, that they're able to and can manage the different spaces with their different sensory loads, then you again lose the value of that inclusive architecture.
Thank you.
The comments were from Jennifer. So,
Yes,
so which I'm very happy to read them out. If either she was responding to my question before, and has just very succinctly summarised what she said just now. But are there any more questions from online?
I'd like to ask you. First of all, I do really think this is a very important topic. I mean, just even recent events in Bondi show how important it is managing mental health well. And whether you look at the budget from NDIS or the relief of parents having a kid come home and move on, this is very, very important. But I just wanted to ask, because you mentioned about bringing the outside in.
Yes.
And so I wanted to know, did they talk about like pot plants and things like that, actual plants and things bringing in? Or are they talking about like murals and paintings and artificial plants which don't have the scent? Or does either one work?
They didn't talk about bringing in natural environments or plants, or they were talking about, because in early childhood education centers, I think already some of the learning happens outside. So they talked about the ground, the outdoor space. So it can be actually more connected to indoor spaces, or those retreat spaces that we talked about. If there is more connection, so the outdoor space can actually work as a kind of like retreat space. So in another study that I had on vertical schools, it was really interesting. Because there is a kind of debate around that in vertical schools, people don't have that much connection with natural, students don't have that much connection with natural environments that they need in these settings. And we already have some terraces, all those schools that I use as case studies, they had terraces connected to the classrooms. And students were really happy with those terraces more than the school grounds. They still had the school grounds, not big enough or not bigger than those horizontal schools, but because they had a terrace very available just right from the classrooms, they were really happy about this kind of very easy transition that they could into the outdoor spaces. Yes.
Thanks, Fatemeh. Great presentation. I'm just wondering, you also, on the topic of nature and plants, you talked about sort of animals. Are there any schools that are sort of, I guess, have a program, an active program of, I guess, bringing in animals of some description?
Not that I'm aware of. Jen, do you think that there are schools that have this kind of programs?
You're still on mute, sorry, Jennifer.
Yeah, there certainly are. So, I mean, there's a couple of things there. Is that one of the things that the experts did talk about was natural patterns. So if you think of, the word's escaping me, the spiral. What's that called, Fatemeh? The spiral. You know how trees grow in a spiral? What's that? Fractals. The patterns that are resembling those patterns found in nature, like fractals, are much less triggering for some young people who might be triggered by tessellated patterns and things like that. So early childhood settings have always had a certain amount of you'll get a certificate, a certain amount of plants inside and indoor-outdoor programs. So that's a long tradition in early childhood that stems from the sort of German concept of the kindergarten, so the garden. But there are also a lot of therapeutic programs that are developing now that offer things like horse handling. For young people who've experienced both trauma and are on the neurodiverse spectrum. So the idea that engagement with plants and animals and natural environments is settling and creates a good space for people to be able to engage with academic or either academic learning or creative arts is definitely something that circulates in education, but it's not well funded, particularly in our public systems. So you might find private schools do it, or it's left to the sort of edges, those specialist schools that you were talking about before, which are either sort of autism specific schools or schools that kind of pick up kids when they've really experienced a huge amount of trauma. The point of doing this kind of work in early childhood is that for a lot of children who are neurodiverse, trauma starts to layer because they have bad experiences in school, and that makes them even more sensitive. So by controlling kind of sensitivity in the early years, the hope is that you would have less children who are pushed out of mainstream systems later on. Personally, I'd love to work in a horse school, wouldn't you?
Just a final comment, really, Fatemeh and Jennifer. Have you drawn any parallels with some of the design issues around people with dementia, which seemed, what you were talking about seemed to ring bells with me about my understanding about the sorts of new designs that are needed to help people get through dementia, sort of the wayfinding and making places inclusive, which don't frighten them and so on, and those sorts of things. There seems to be a lot of similarities there.
Yes, actually, one of the architects that we talked to published a lot in this space. It brought this the same point that these design principles are being used in this, for designing spaces for dementia, to cater for people with dementia. So yeah, there is a lot of overlaps here.
Sure. Well, thank you. Look, it's about 5 o'clock now, so I'd like us to thank Fatemeh for the presentation today. So just as a reminder, we run the seminar every 2 weeks, and the next seminar is going to be on the 5th of May, when our own Marianne Hosseini and Alessandra Buxton will be giving the presentation for the Higher Degree Research Symposium. So meanwhile, I'd like to thank our speaker, and wish everyone an enjoyable weekend, and thank you for joining us.
Okay.